Hi everyone, if you are new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I cover all sorts of issues to do with socio-politics, current affairs, occasionally popular culture, but that tends to be the go-to of my channel, politics, where I just discuss my views on these issues, and I talk about things that I think are important. Um, to my subscribers who are already out there, thank you for all your support. Um, the channel is gradually growing, so that's always good. Now, I have spoken about this subject quite a lot. It's something I feel very strongly about. So this one is just kind of a roundup of some of my views because I think it's one of those things that is always important. It's not like, okay, it's topical right now. It's always important, always. And the subject is crime and justice, which is, of course, a broad field. It covers a lot of things, but I remain absolutely adamant that our legal establishment has failed victims for the most part. I believe or I adamantly believe, I should say, that it's just there is just still a gulf between the legal establishment and public opinion. Now, I should caveat this. It would be wrong to say that every single case is misplaced, every single judge gets it wrong. There are sometimes outcomes I think, okay, that's about right. So I am not saying that every single case has a sentence that doesn't match the crime. And I don't even think we have the worst system in the world in terms of accountability toward victims. I mean, there's parts of the world where institutions in general have broken down. There is no law and order. Victims of crime don't have any hope of getting justice. Look at a country like Haiti, basically collapsed, where gangs rule the place literally. I mean, how's a victim of crime going to get justice in a country like that? So, in the international scope, we're far from the worst. And if we look at actually the penal system, I'd say Britain is roughly somewhere in the middle. What I mean by that is in the United States, you get people put away for years for personal drug use in some cases. I actually think the American system in some ways is too harsh in some situations. It does depend on the state. Some states are like Britain, they're unduly lenient. But then again, if we look at Europe, you know, the liberal left look to the Nordic model. They kind of idolize the Nordic model as something we should look up to. But I do not think that would ever work in the UK. I don't think the British people would ever accept the Nordic model or the Dutch model for that, whereby custodial sentencing is used on a minimal basis, where you have prisons that really are little different from hotels, except they have a bit more security. I mean, really, it's I have a big problem with that because I think that well, firstly, if we look at Sweden, it's a false narrative that it's a very safe society. Sweden now has one of the highest gun crime rates in Europe, and there are other components involved in that. Um, but the city of Malmo, for example, has actually become quite a dangerous city. And this isn't sort of Trumpian propaganda. This is just a fact. It's what has happened in recent years. So the Nordic softly, softly approach, I'm not so sure that it has been successful. Maybe it was for a while. Maybe those countries could point to low crime rate for a while. But certainly in the case of Sweden, that isn't the case. And even the Swedes are realizing that they're having to get a bit tougher. Um, so I'm not convinced that the Nordic model is something we should be looking up to. Um, the irony about this is if people heard my rhetoric, they'd say I'm a real hardliner, I'm really conservative on crime. I I've no problem calling myself a conservative. But in terms of being a hardliner, I don't actually think I'm that hardline. I think I'm just normal. I mean, I don't say that dangerous criminals, we should lock them up and throw away the key. I don't say that we should bring back capital punishment even. I'm not sure that we should because if mistakes are made, there's no going back. So I don't even say that. What I do say is that current sentencing remains too soft in too many cases. I came across a horrendous case last night. I signed a petition. Um, And I may put a link actually on this video, which has all the details. I'm not going to read it out in detail here, but suffice to say, it was a horrendous case. Um, an evil thug, it's the only way to describe the guy, had gouged out his partner's eyes, literally gouged her eyes out. He got 6 years. Initially, I think he got a longer sentence because presumably the parole board found him to be too dangerous. They don't always get it wrong. But now he's up for release after, I believe he was jailed in 2011, so that's 13, 14 years. I don't think someone like that should be released. I don't think a man who gouges a woman's eyes out, who gouges out anyone's eyes out, is fit to be in the public. I'll put a link to that case, but please do consider signing it on change.org. It would be terrifying for the victim to think that someone like that is back out in society. Now, people might say, well, I didn't actually murder her. But when you've destroyed someone's life in that sense, with a callous act of violence, I don't think it's too far off murder. I mean, that's heinous. It's absolutely sadistic, um, chilling. I don't see how someone who could do that could ever be fit for the public. You know, he might hoodwink parole officers or something, but I just think that there's some crimes that are so depraved, so sadistic that you just, I think the notion of rehabilitation in those cases is perverse. I'm not suggesting he should be locked up like Hannibal Lecter in solitary confinement, but he certainly shouldn't be walking around public. There's a lot of things to look at when it comes to crime and justice. There is the elephant in the room. Our prison system is overcrowded. I don't ignore that. Um, and I accept that that's something Labour inherited from the last government. So I don't, I know Labour is in a difficult position with this. Um, they've insisted that people who are released early will be deemed to be safe enough to have been so, but we've already seen that some of them have reoffended. Um, and there was someone gloating. Starmer said he was disgusted to see that. Um, during the campaign, Labour spoke about building new prison spaces. That was, if not a lie, it was misleading because they've now changed the rhetoric to, oh, we've no choice but to release them. And that may be true, but they shouldn't have been talking about building more prison spaces when they knew it was BS. They knew they weren't going to do that. That was wrong. Um, and I again reiterate, I think Labour has a misleading message on crime. On one hand, you have Starmer and Cooper talking tough. You know, Cooper talks about cracking down on violence against women and girls. Starmer talks about cracking down on antisocial behaviour. And yet, the prisons minister, Lord Timpson, and I don't want to sound like a broken record because I have mentioned it before, he says that we punish too many people. Simpson's known for having a rehabilitation scheme where he was a businessman actually before he joined the House of Lords. Um, his name was with the Timpson Key chain, key making business in Manchester. And part of that rehabilitation was having ex offenders in his factories. Now, I want to quantify my position on this. I'm not against it in principle. If someone has done their time and they're getting back out into society, it makes sense that they have some sort of purpose. Otherwise, they could reoffend. I'm not against that. So I don't criticise Timpson for that scheme. But it did make me very angry when he said that we punish too many people. He claimed that up to two thirds of everyone in prison shouldn't be there. So according to Timpson, only one third of inmates, which would be around 30,000 people, 33,000, should be in prison. So, according to Lord Timpson, upwards of 70,000 people, because the British prison population, well, actually England and Wales, about 100,000. Now, I think that's an extreme position. I think it's tone deaf, and I think Lord Timpson needs to explain that to victims of crime, why he thinks that most inmates shouldn't be there. It doesn't go so far as to say no one should be there, because for a politician that would just be, absolutely career suicide. But I think it's bad enough that he says too many people are punished. And that frankly infuriated me for a cabinet minister. Um, well, he's not quite cabinet level, but he's a minister. To say that, I just think was astonishing. And I understand it's his brief to sort out the prison's crisis. So he's going to have to think outside the box. But I think for a government minister to come out with that, to say, and at the time it kind of didn't get that much heat, which surprised me. I thought the tabloids would have been all over that. And frankly, I would have supported them if they were, because I think it's a disgrace for a government minister to say that we punish too many people. What sort of message does that send out to victims of crime? Who it's also actually a false narrative that the liberal left put out there. Because if you listen to the liberal left, their attitude to crime is very much, and I fully admit I'm partisan on this issue. This isn't an issue I'm in the middle. I am absolutely partisan. I think the liberal left is just plain wrong when it comes to crime. Because their narrative is that we punish too many people, that we just throw away people, like we lock them up and throw away the keys. What they're negating to consider is that actually most offenders don't go to prison. Most offenders will either get a community sentence or a suspended sentence. That's the reality. So, yes, we have the biggest prison population in Europe, at least in Western Europe, but that doesn't mean that in Britain criminals are just thrown into prison. Again, most criminals are not thrown into prison. There are situations, I mean, I wouldn't say a first time shoplifter should be put in prison, certainly not. I wouldn't say that someone has severe dependency issues and hasn't used violence should necessarily be put in prison. But if they are shoplifting to fuel their habit, that is something that absolutely has to be addressed. And yes, I think they should face accountability for that. They should get the treatment. I don't think people should be punished for addiction in of itself. But if they're shoplifting to fuel it, what about the shopkeeper who's having to constantly replenish their stock? I honestly think, and this will be a controversial point, I think too many excuses are made for addiction in the sense that I know it is something that's a medical problem. I know it's something that is very, very difficult to control. But if someone is not getting treatment, and yeah, I do hold them accountable to some extent. I sympathize in terms of the grip that the addiction has on them, but only to an extent. If they are committing violence as part of their addiction, if they're shoplifting as part of their addiction, then the onus is on them to get help for that addiction. And if they don't, and they get punished for the crime that they've committed, honestly, I've limited sympathy. I mean, if an alcoholic, and this isn't to generalize, not all alcoholics are like this, but if an alcoholic is violent, I don't think they could say, "Oh, well, it's my alcohol problem." I don't think that should serve as an excuse. We have Alcoholics Anonymous. We have sources out there that can help people in that situation. If they're refusing to take responsibility and admit that they've got a problem, and they commit an offence, then I honestly have limited sympathy. Um, but I accept that, there may well be a situation where some offenders will have to be released early to ease the overcrowding situation. So what do we do about that? Well, the Justice Secretary proposed that when you have community sentencing in these cases, it could be more robust, and the image of community sentence could be seen to be tougher, because the general public see community sentencing as soft. Rightly or wrongly, that is how it is perceived. They see it as, okay, you've been a shoplifter or you've committed violent assault and you're going to clean up a few gardens for no pay. The public see it as too soft. So I think one method, if this is absolutely necessary to release people early, is to um, make community sentencing a lot tougher. Increase the hours that they have to do, force them to wear like a uniform saying that they are a offender, so shame them. Yeah, I absolutely think that's important because otherwise, what's the point? Otherwise, people will think they're just a regular tradesperson doing a job. There has to be a shaming aspect involved. It has to be unpleasant. It has to be enough to be a deterrent. Because if it isn't, if you get a hardened criminal who says, "Oh, whatever, I'll just clean a few gardens and go back to my life of crime," then what is the point? You see, the liberal left always say custodial sentencing isn't a deterrent, and they'll point to the fact that the recidivism rate is high. Well, I agree that there has to be something looked at in terms of how can prison work better. Where I strongly disagree is the idea that prison itself is the problem. The issue is how prison is run. I do think there's liberal left zealots out there who would absolutely close prisons if they had a chance, even for the most serious criminals, even for murderers, arsonists, you know, um, violent domestic abusers, terrorists. I honestly think there are people who are so zealous in terms of anti punishment narrative that they would seriously think about closing all prisons. But Timpson isn't going to go that far because he's a politician. He knows that that would be shooting himself in the foot. But I do question that man. I do question his attitude that we punish too many people. I find that concerning. Whatever good he has done in terms of rehabilitation, I think that was a tone deaf statement to make. And it's contradictory when you have the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary talking tough, and yet someone that Keir Starmer says he has a lot of faith in is coming out and saying we punish too many people. Which is it? Labour has to decide, is it tough on crime or is it soft on crime? Can't be both. Um, so I'm not against community sentencing if it is sufficiently a deterrent, and I'm not sure that it is. Um, there's another thing which Dr. Lawrence Newlove looked at recently, which is um, the prevalence of career criminals accounting for a large proportion of crimes. Now, if those people got mandatory custodial sentences, and in fact, this has been proven to work in jurisdictions where it's been the case, where you have taken them off the street, it has actually significantly reduced crime. When you have a career criminal who has notched up 40, 50, 60 offences, this is no exaggeration. You take them off the street, it makes a difference. So why isn't that happening? What excuse is there for judges to give them a suspended sentence? I think that is a disgrace. And it's another reason why I think there should be more scrutiny of judges. Now, I think there should be more scrutiny across the board, actually. When we look at the justice establishment, we can break it into several um, sectors. So you have the Ministry of Justice, which is legislative level, right? You have parliamentarians setting the laws. That is what is legal, what is illegal, what's an arrestable offence, what's an indictable offence. Um, and they will set sentencing minimum and maximum guidelines. But then within that, it goes to the Sentencing Council of England and Wales and their equivalent in Scotland, the Sentencing Council of Scotland. Again, Northern Ireland's a bit different. But they then set the sentencing guidelines. I have long maintained they have a lot to answer for because they say that they simply set the guidelines. But if they are issuing softer sentencing guidelines to judges, then what happens? The judges turn around and say their hands are tied. So you have here three components. You have the Ministry of Justice, legislators. You have the Sentencing Council, which is an advisory board. It's made up of barristers, one ex superintendent. Um, that's the sort of people it's supposedly independent, but I do think they should face a lot of accountability for self sentencing, and I've told them this directly. I've been in correspondence with them. Um, to be fair, they've answered me each time, and they've refuted some of my claims, but they did say they'd give me an update on the latest sentencing guidelines, which I'm grateful for. I'm not convinced that they are not soft on crime. I think they are ideologically soft on crime, but you know. And then we have judges. Now, with judges, there are times I accept that judges have their hands tied. But I would also say this: if judges really think that they have their hands tied and they would like to impose tougher penalties, they can speak up. They are authority figures within the justice system. They can speak up. They can question the sentencing council. They can question legislators. They can say, I believe I should have the power to issue stronger sentences here. So judges can't really complain that they have their hands tied if they aren't really speaking up about it. If they're just saying, oh, don't blame me. And again, this isn't every judge. There's circumstances where judges do get it right. I'm not saying every judge is out of touch. I think some absolutely are. I think some judges are not fit to be judges. I remember one case, the judge actually tried blaming the victim, saying the young lady dressed provocatively. That was a disgusting, appalling attitude to a victim of sexual assault. He apologised. I don't think that's good enough. I think he should have been immediately dismissed. Someone like that is not fit to be a judge. Um, and I do think, again, rightly or wrongly, there is a public perception that the establishment protects itself. Edwards avoided a custodial sentence despite prolific predatory behaviour, not just a one off, prolific. Now, some people will say, he's a senior BBC newsman. Why did he not get a custodial sentence? And then you get people put away for inciting violence. Now, to be clear on this, I think if someone incites violence, they should face quite a hefty. I don't think it's a small thing. I think that is a serious offence, but um, I'm not sure that it's more serious than what Hugh Edwards done. So I think there is a perception of elitism in our justice establishment. I mean, what I am driving at with all of this is there is still a serious disconnect between the justice establishment and the public. I'm not suggesting that we necessarily copy the American system where judges are elected, although I'm not entirely against it as an idea. I don't think it's going to happen in this country. But at the very least, the powers that be can be more accountable. Um, it's a disgrace, that victims of crime and relatives of victims, the pressure is put on them to campaign. The pressure is put on them to, spend years of campaigning to get a sentence that more matches the original crime. And eventually, if they're lucky, if they've had enough petition signatures, they might get a say in the Court of Appeal. That doesn't always happen. More often than not, a case is referred to the Court of Appeal for being unduly lenient, and the Court of Appeal upholds the original sentence. Now, sometimes, granted, it works the other way, where you get people petitioning for a sentence to be overturned for being unduly harsh, and the Court of Appeal rules that it stands. So again, they don't always get it wrong. But I would say, if I'm looking at the overall picture, there are simply too many cases, not every case, but too many cases where the sentence doesn't match the gravity of the crime. I would point to dangerous driving. This isn't in the same category, obvious, as murder, but if someone is driving in a dangerous way and they paralyze someone for life, it's a disgrace that, as was the case in Norfolk, the perpetrator got 2 years and a driving ban for a number of years. I can't recall off the top of my head what it was. 2 years. Now, I accept in that case he didn't set out to paralyze a woman, but his recklessness, his selfishness caused that. I think should have been 7 years minimum and a lifetime driving ban. I think if you seriously paralyze someone or kill someone, you should never be allowed behind a wheel again. If your job relies on it, tough. Change your job. If you have to drive your children to school, tough. Make alternative arrangements. Driving is a privilege, it's not a right. Our justice system has to reflect that. Violent young offenders who terrorize the public, again, they get a tap on the wrist. It's a disgrace. This only enables them to continue that behaviour. Starmer talks about being tough on antisocial behaviour. Let him prove it. Let's see tougher penalties for antisocial behaviour. I'm going to wrap this up because that's more or less the meat of what I want to say here. But I don't say every single case is misplaced. I don't say every single case is awful and out of touch. But I do insist that too many cases are, and I think the justice establishment as a whole need to just get a grasp that they are still not getting it. They can say that sentencing has got tougher, and it has got marginally tougher in the last 15 years, but only marginally, not enough. Legislators, the sentencing council, judges need to understand public anger. They can claim that they do. Well, put it this way, if they really do, if they understand the public are angry, they're not reflecting it in their actions. And if I have further correspondence with the sentencing council, I will say that. I will say, look, you're saying that you understand public anger, but you're not reflecting that at all. They actually said to me, they have public consultation, although it's limited, and they said that in the case of dangerous driving, some correspondents were proposing no custodial sentence, and they said, oh, but we insist there should be a custodial sentence. So they were actually saying to me, but we're tougher than some of the correspondents. I do not believe that the majority of the British public have that attitude. So yeah, it's better than nothing that they at least recognise it should be custodial. But I honestly think if you were to do a vox pop on the street and put to the public some of these crimes and the context in which they happened, I honestly, confidently would say the majority of the public would say we need tougher sentencing. That doesn't mean the majority of the British public are kind of hard right, flog him and hang him reactionaries. It means that the majority of people just don't think that our justice system matches public opinion. Um, I don't think my views are particularly extreme at all. I'm against the death penalty. I also think that people who have suffered miscarriages of justice. I mean, there was a case in Manchester, Andy Malkinson, a man who spent 17 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. I believe strongly in those cases they should be treated as victims. They shouldn't have to pay any board and bed, for being wrongfully incarcerated, and they should get compensation for that. A miscarriage of justice is a terrible thing. I have just as much sympathy for an innocent person put behind bars as I do for victims of crime. So, I certainly don't say that we should be draconian with justice. I just think we should be tougher. And another thing that really irritates me about the liberal left is if you talk about this, if you talk about being tough on crime, they say you're just looking for revenge, it's punitive. No, the absolute starting point of justice, in my opinion, should be to recognize that a crime against society is morally wrong, and therefore it should be held to account. If a society doesn't have values, if a society doesn't have those sort of judgments, then what do we have as a society? We break down into anarchy. Society has to have order, and part of that is holding the guilty accountable. So it's frankly a brain dead argument to say that punishment is punitive. If you cannot accept that punishment should be part of justice, don't tell me that you believe in justice because you don't. And I think some liberal leftists don't. They're just against punishment. Um, Most of them will not go so far as to say there should be no punishment, as they know that would be an absurd position to take. But too many, I think, have a strange attitude to custodial sentencing. It's something that does not sit well with me at all. If you cannot recognise that a serious offence like GBH, rape, arson, um, murder, these sort of things should result in a serious penalty, then you really need to get clued up. You need to get into the real world. I do feel very strongly about that. Okay, I've said a lot here. I'll put a link to that particular case I mentioned about the horrendous case of the young lady getting her, it sounds awful even saying it, getting her eyes gouged out. The evil monster that done that, in my opinion, should not be on the streets. Um, Certainly should be in jail for a lot longer, at least till he's an old man. Um, so I'll put a link to that. It has more details about the specifics. Please do consider signing it.